All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for braving the cold and being here for tonight's actually very special event. My name's Alex Cooley. I'm professor of political science at Barnard College, and I also direct the Harriman Institute at Columbia for the study of Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's panel on thinking about a future Russia policy, presidential politics challenges, and issues. And this is the first event of the year under our Russia Public Policy program, which is a joint program that we run with our colleagues at NYU's Jordan Center. Josh Tucker is on the end. He's the other co-chair and co-moderator of this series. The whole purpose of the series, that when we started, I guess it's our fourth year now, was to highlight issues that come up that seem to be of really critical importance to public policy that involve Russia in some capacity. And given that Russia has been both a domestic story in terms of domestic politics and Russian interference and the Mueller investigation, but also a critical foreign policy story and a critical bilateral relationship, we thought what better time than to engage some of the foreign policy advisors and some of the major Democratic campaigns on how their candidates are thinking about Russia-related questions. And just a note here that we also reached out to the Warren and the Biden campaigns, and they were unable to join us today. So that's the idea in theory. Let me just quickly introduce our panelists. Next to me, Matt Duss, who is foreign policy advisor to the Bernie Sanders 2020 presidential campaign. Next to him, CARMEL MARTIN, who's the national policy director for the Beto O'Rourke 2020 presidential campaign. And of course, the campaign has been suspended, but we're still really grateful that CARMEL could join us to offer perspectives about these issues. Then we have Celeste Wallander, who is advisor on foreign policy for the Pete Buttigieg campaign. I knew I was going to mangle it. Former special, that was okay? Okay. Former special assistant to the president and senior director for Russia, Eurasia 2013-2017, and also served as deputy assistant secretary of defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia in 2009-2012. Then one seat over, Peter Clement, who is here at Columbia University. He's a senior fellow at the Harriman Institute, senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, and also authored the briefing paper backgrounds that went to the campaigns about the state of US-Russia relations. So he's been involved in this too. And then Josh on the end. So the format is we've asked each of the candidates to provide a 5 to 10 minute statement about any of these issues in terms of what are US's core national interests in relations with Russia, what should be the governing principles of US policy, what issues should the new administration prioritize, and how should we engage with the issue or the legacy or the ongoing possibility of Russian domestic interference. So they can take these in any order that they want. Then we'll ask the panel a couple of follow-up questions, and then we'll open it up to you for your thoughts and your Q&A. Just a reminder, everything today is on the record, and you are being filmed. So if you do ask a question, we're going to ask you that you identify yourself. That having said, welcome everyone. Thanks again for making time in your very busy schedules. And Matt, let's kick it off with you.
Thank you. Yeah. Is this on? So first of all, thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and really a privilege to be on the panel with these friends and colleagues, including CARMEL, my former colleague for the Center for American Progress. Very nice to see you again. So rather than kind of run down a list of priorities, I think I just wanted to make 2 quick points, and maybe we can get into some details later or in the Q&A.
Yeah, maybe just speak into the mic here.
Sorry.
Yeah, there we go.
Rather than run down a list of priorities, I thought I might just make 2 quick points to kind of set the stage for how Senator Sanders is viewing the U.S.-Russia relationship and U.S. policy towards Russia. And we can get into some of the details a bit later. And that has to do with, first of all, the strength of American democracy and second, the strength of our alliances. With regard to American democracy, when we talk about foreign policy, but especially with regard to Russia, I think we need to talk about the health of our democracy, or how our democracy is unhealthy in some ways, because I think when we look at what was done in 2016, it did not begin in 2016. The groundwork for the Russian campaign of interference in the 2016 election was laid over years before that. But fissures were exploited by Russia and by Putin. They were not created. Those fissures existed. These are really contentious issues, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether issues of racism, run down the list, anti-Muslim bigotry. These issues are very real in our society. So when we look at how, what our vision is for the American people, what our vision is of our own society, when we talk about really important issues like criminal justice, like mass incarceration, like healthcare, these are not issues of domestic policy alone. These are very much foreign policy issues, because if we want to talk about how we advance our interests and values abroad, we need to make sure we are honoring and serving those values here at home. The second point I'll make is with regard to the strength of our alliances. At the core, I think, of American power and American leadership and America's role in the world is our unparalleled network of alliances and relationships. As America's relative share of power continues to decline, and it will continue to decline, we have to face that fact. As China rises, as other economies rise, as India, that network of alliances will become even more important. And I want to be clear, America, even though its relative share of power is declining, is still extraordinarily powerful. We don't want to overstate the case here. But I think understanding that these alliances are at the core of how we operate in the world, Putin certainly understands that, which is why he has attempted at every turn to isolate the United States from its allies. And unfortunately, it seems in Trump he has someone who shares a very zero-sum view of international relations. For Trump, it's, I'm going to sit at the table, they'll sit on the other side, we'll come to a bilateral relationship, and we'll win, and they will lose. Restoring the consensus behind positive-sum international relations, I think, is a really important project of American foreign policy, but particularly of the Democratic field in this election. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt.
Should I go for it?
Yeah,
Great,
please, yeah.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming out on such a cold night, and thanks to Josh and Alex for having us. I'm honored to be on such an esteemed panel, and particularly as a lame duck person in the room. But it's fun to reflect back on our work on these issues during the campaign. And I thought to start, I might focus in on one of the questions that Columbia and what you suggested to us in terms of thinking about what the U.S.'s core national interests in its relations with Russia, and what should the orienting principles of future U.S. policy be. And I thought the orienting principles was particularly interesting. And there's three things I think we need to think about moving forward with U.S. policy as it relates to Russia, but really more broadly. And the first is a recognition that our interests and our values are fundamentally intertwined. And this is something that I think in a lot of his actions, Donald Trump is trying to move us away from. I think he's taking action after action, particularly on the global stage, where he's arguing that U.S. interests require him to take that action, even though it's fundamentally in tension with our values as a country. Would point to looking the other way with respect to Saudi Arabia, tolerating human rights abuses in the interests of military alliances, proxy wars with Iran, abandoning the Kurds but sticking in to defend the oil. And I think part of the job of those from the progressive side of the debate is to sort of draw attention to this and to make the case that fundamentally our interests can't be separated from our values, and that in the long term, if we abandon our values as a nation in terms of our actions on the global stage, our interests will be greatly diminished. And I think we see that through this administration's actions over and over again. And in terms of Russia's interference in our democracy, they're essentially attacking a very core American value, which is democratic governance, So something that we need to do, as Matt alluded to, is stand up to Russia on that issue, but also we have to get our own house in order and rebuild confidence in our democratic system. So that needs to be a top priority for the next president. The second principle that I think we need to keep in mind moving forward is that although in terms of foreign policy, job number one is to keep America and Americans safe, I think we need to recognize that increasingly American security isn't just physical, that we're being attacked in terms of our democratic institutions, our ability to consume truthful information, and the integrity of our economy. So moving forward and keeping America safe, that is as much a domestic issue as it is a foreign policy issue. We need to invest in technological innovation so we're leading the world, not allowing other authoritarian regimes to lead the world in terms of cybersecurity. And we need to invest in our democratic institutions, in our ability to have a free and vibrant press. And the third principle that I thought was worth calling out is that although we need a president who's willing to stand up to authoritarian governments like Russia, and particularly when they're attacking our country and attacking our democracy, we also have to be open to looking for opportunities for cooperation where we have common interests or both have interests. They might not be in common. And two areas that I think need to be priorities moving forward would be nuclear proliferation, which we're obviously going in the wrong direction on, and through the collapse of our bilateral relationship with Russia on that topic, and climate. So I think that sounds a little bit contradictory, that we have to stand up to Russia, but at the same time build a stronger relationship for action in these critical areas. I think both are required and will be one of the biggest challenges that the next president faces.
Great. Thanks so much. Celeste?
Great. Thank you, Alex. Thank you to Columbia and NYU and Alex and Josh for giving me the opportunity to be here to discuss with you what a U.S. Policy on Russia should look like for the 21st century. And I want to start by exactly framing this as a 21st century issue, and to argue that our policies need to contemplate what the world is going to look like, not just right now in the headlines right now, but in 2050 or 2060, when many of the future leaders of the United States will be grappling with these problems, who are the kind of people in this room need to be thinking down the road how to secure American interests and values, as has already been pointed out. So we need to think about what the world will look like in a couple of decades, in the middle of this century, because that's how Russia and China are thinking about how they are dealing with us, how they are investing, planning, strategizing, and investing in their policies. So we need to be proactive and think down the road about what that world looks like. And to think that far out, you can't just think about specific issues. You have to think in terms of our deep core principles, our values, our interests, and the relationships that the United States has and will have that helps to advance those values and interests and protect those against those who might, and often do, harm them and threaten them. Now, all three of these pillars, I'm going to give examples of how they should define our policy on Russia. So the world needs an America ready to counter the rise of authoritarianism while revitalizing democracy at home and advancing it with our allies and among our allies. Countries with models, authoritarian countries with models whose values fly in the face of our own values, that contradict our values, our tolerance, our inclusiveness, our respect for human, political, and civil rights. They actually, we see them in the case of Chinese techno-authoritarianism, Russian crony capitalism, and anti-modern theocratic regimes in the Middle East. And they pose a challenge to us by posing a challenge to our values, not only our interests. And it's no accident that it's the hostility to our values that drives countries like Russia and China to challenge the United States and counter it with our allies and in our relationships across the globe. And in Putin's Russia specifically, we are faced with a self-interested, disruptive, and adversarial actor. An actor that represents a striking example of what happens when a country tries to advance capitalism without democracy. You get a system that devolves and deforms into crony capitalism and oligarchy that doesn't drive the interests of society and doesn't balance those values of society and the citizens, but instead drives the interests of regimes and counters those that the United States holds dear. And the forces unleashed in an authoritarian and crony capitalist Russia, nationalism, xenophobia, homophobia, corruption, and the repression of the press, are both highly disturbing inside of Russia and disturbing for a Russia that is active and ascendant globally. Because Russia's crony capitalism at home threatens American interests, values, and relationships globally. We see this in Ukraine, in Syria, Turkey, Venezuela, Africa, among other places. So this is not just a concern about what's going on inside of Russia. It's that the implications of that kind of crony authoritarianism inside of Russia is a foreign policy that counters American interests and American values and hurts the interests and values of our citizens. Most egregiously, of course, and my colleagues on the panel have mentioned this, is their unacceptable interference in our elections, which has weakened America by helping to elect an unstable administration and by eroding confidence in our democracy itself. We have to prevent and deter this kind of intervention in the future. But we must also deal with the real weaknesses that the Russians exploited. Not just the gaps in our technology, but our capacity to too easily be turned against one another. In this sense, domestic problems from racism to social isolation have revealed themselves to be national security vulnerabilities that Russia exploited and used to harm our security and our prosperity. So to prevent Russian interference in our elections and in our democracy, we have a variety of tools that we can and should use. Economic, intelligence, diplomatic, and cyber tools. And those tools are right now at our disposal and need to be updated and made ready to deal with this very real challenge that Russia poses. The goal should be to create a deterrence framework to make it clear to the Russian leadership that its efforts to interfere in our elections cannot succeed or would come at too high a price to the Russian leadership itself. And it's the credibility of that deterrent capability that will help to safeguard the American elections going forward in 2020 and in years going beyond. We've also, though, already seen regionally destabilizing Russian behavior, from military intervention in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine to violation of the INF Treaty and development of dangerous and destabilizing new weapons systems. So future US policy towards Russia must include a regional security framework, one that works with our allies and partners, that promotes stability in Europe, including Central and Eastern Europe, and incentivizes Russia to adhere to international norms, to international law. And central to this will be our partnerships, because the United States cannot advance and protect the global order on its own. It has to have allies and partners. A renewed and reinvigorated NATO, 70 years after NATO's founding, we must repair and renew NATO for the 20th century. But beyond NATO, the network of European and global security and economic institutions that have advanced the liberal order that protects American values and advances American interests. Russian aggression against Ukraine is an attack on the agreed principles and rules of European and global order that protect global citizens beyond Ukraine, including Americans. Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is protected by the UN Charter and European security arrangements. Those protect not only Ukraine, they protect all the countries of Europe and the United States itself. So in attacking Ukraine, Russia has attacked a global order that protects and advances all of our values and our interests. Russia should be living up to its commitments to those international agreements and those international institutions. It should be living by its agreement to allow the OSCE mission in Ukraine to oversee a ceasefire and implementation of the Minsk agreement, which Russia itself has signed. We must keep targeted, tough, and effective economic sanctions on Russia, not because sanctions are an end in of themselves, but because sanctions are the incentive to push Russia back to living up to its international obligations and its duty as a major player in the international order. But countering Russia's aggression also means supporting Ukraine's independence and ability to make and implement sovereign foreign policy decisions by supporting Ukrainian political, economic, and defense capabilities. Although Ukraine is not a formal treaty ally of the United States should be willing to help Ukraine develop a modern and capable defense force to defend its citizens, including advice, education, training, and sales of weapons that are appropriate to Ukraine's defensive needs and requirements. We should not shy away from responsible defense assistance to a democracy in the heart of Europe that is under assault because its citizens have chosen a democratic European path. We won't be able to meet this challenge by sticking to a 20th century strategy, and I'm not arguing for simply a reversion to the institutions that helped to preserve peace and stability in the 20th century. But Russia has exploited our vulnerabilities to harm American values, interests, and partnerships, which is why perhaps the single best thing we can do to protect ourselves, counter Russian authoritarianism abroad, is to model the strength of inclusive democratic capitalism in the United States.
Thank you. Peter.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me today and my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm also delighted to see a fair number of students out there, so bravo for you.
Yeah, just speak into the
Sorry about
microphone
that.
there. Thank you.
Old technology.
20th
This
century
is like being in my
technology.
classroom where the usual AV problems arise. For my students who are here, you all know that problem. So I thought I'd step back a little bit, provide a little bit of historical context, and look a little bit about where we might go in the near term in the relationship with Russia. No surprise, Russia has been a problem for U.S. policymakers for more than 100 years. You may recall when the Bolsheviks came to power, we did not have relations with the Soviet Union until 1934. Fast forward to the present, and now we have more than 5 years of pretty strained relations. In large part, there are many factors. I won't go through all of them, but the two big ones in terms of U.S. politics, the intervention in Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, and the continued frozen conflict, if I can use that phrase, in the East, which I think is by design. The second one, and the one most people have already alluded to here, is the interference in the U.S. election. I don't think there's any question about that. The evidence is extremely compelling. A lot has been written about it. So, what do we do about all this? There are those who would argue that we need to adhere to a really tough regime of containment, sanctions, and not actually engage the Russians. I didn't hear that at the table, by the way, but I do know that there are people who think that is the right answer. There are those who would argue, well, maybe you need to think a little bit more because there may be some issues that are of such overwhelming security relevance that you should engage the Russians. So with that in mind, I want to flash back to a couple of major events and agreements. I'm struck in looking back to the 1960s. I looked at some of the major agreements, if you will, and when they occurred. And interestingly, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was followed barely 10 months later by the nuclear test ban treaty that John Kennedy signed with Khrushchev. In 1968, after the Soviets went into Czechoslovakia, the U.S. began arms control talks that culminated in the anti-ballistic missile treaty of 1972. 1987, we signed an INF agreement. That agreement took about 7 years to negotiate, and I would remind people, during those 7 years, we were in a pretty bad place with the Soviets. I recall President Reagan describing the Soviets as the evil empire. We had this other problem with the competition in the third world. And we had a big problem with a war scare in 1983. Despite all of that, somehow negotiators continued to work assiduously for 7 years, and they reached an agreement in 1987. If you want a more current day example, I'm also struck that the New START agreement that was signed in 2009 was done barely a year after the Russians went into Georgia. And at that point, everybody was aghast, and we all waved our fingers at the Russians. And yet somehow we managed to find a way to reach an understanding on something that also mattered in a big strategic way. So where am I going with this? If you think about the near term, there are obvious areas where we can both engage, and I would call it low-hanging fruit. We can do more people-to-people diplomacy. We can do what we are already doing in terms of information sharing between our intelligence agencies on issues related to counterterrorism, counter-narcotics. But for my money, I'd like to focus on two big issues that I would hope maybe can get some traction. First is in the area of cyber. I've been spending a little too much time with Professor Healy here. Cyber totally frightens me. But I'm not the only one who worries about cyber. It turns out that Defense Minister Shoigu, in a long interview with Moskovsky-Komsomolets in September 22nd, had a fascinating little comment. And I'm going to read the quote because it just jumped out at me. He said, "The current level of computerization and automation leads to the probability of an error within the arms control system." And he calculated it at the high level. So I saw that, and I immediately ran to my friend Jay Healy and said, "Jay, have you seen this?" I think I might have mentioned it to you, Elise, but I'm just struck that for him to say that made me feel some degree of comfort that even he accepts the idea that this is an area where maybe we really need to be talking to each other. It can be an accident. Unfortunately, I watched Dr. Strangelove the entire movie about a week ago, and it just reminded me, this is the kind of thing you really have to worry about. Not that we're going to have General Ripper running off, sending planes away, but computer glitches, they happen all the time. There are things we can't explain. My great fear in the cyber world is our inability to get attribution. How do you know who really did something? It's really hard. So to deal with this, is it possible that both sides could sit down and say, look, we have a shared concern. This is a serious, threatening kind of an issue. It could be an accident. It could be somebody claiming to be one or the other and alerting people incorrectly of a real threat. Should we not have some kind of a channel, a designated channel? And this is the key. It has to be a channel with a trusted interlocutor so you can both sit down and say, look, here's what's really going on, and have credibility in saying that. That's a big, tall order. I like people thinking like Celeste can do that. It's got to be somebody with both the background, the expertise, the experience, but also some level of engagement and a relationship that is credible to the other side. A related second issue is in the area of arms control. We are now reaching a period where I think there's only one major arms control agreement left, New START, and I'm told that if we don't come to some kind of an understanding on what we're going to do within the next 5 or 6 months, the clock's going to wind down. It does expire in 2021. I'm not going to weigh in on whether arms control is a good thing or a bad thing. One of the things that's very clear is arms control in the way that we used to think of it is very out of date. Unfortunately, there are things that have happened. One of them is cyber. A second big one is the advent of a new generation of weapon systems, hypersonic glide vehicles, underwater high-speed torpedoes, if you will, nuclear-powered cruise missiles. That totally changes the way you think about what are the kinds of things we need to control, monitor, reach some kind of an agreement on. I don't think we can answer that in the next 12 months. If someone were interested in reassessing whether or not we want to play in the arms control business anymore, we probably need a little more time. For me, that says maybe you should think about that 5-year extension period, one that I think would be easy to do politically. I think it only requires the president to say, I really want to do this, and you get the Russians to agree. Am I wrong on this, Celeste? An easy one. You buy 5 years, and within that 5 years, if you want to have a debate and say arms control is impossible, and by the way, there are the Chinese. I'm also hearing some people think the Chinese need to be brought into this. That would make it even more complicated. quite apart from all these new weapon systems. But somebody needs to have a real lively debate and discussion about, is there any future in arms control? This is an era, hopefully, that some people could undertake in a relative future. And I'm going to stop there so we have a lot of time for Q&A.
Okay, great. So let me just pick up on some of these themes to pose the first question, or rather throughout the first comment here. And that concerns a tension that we have, especially, I would say, in media coverage here between Russia, that's led by President Putin, and a kind of real focus on President Putin. Sometimes a demonization, sometimes an emphasis on his personality, on his own kinds of agenda, his domestic authoritarianism on the one hand, and on the other hand, whether Russia itself has any legitimate national interests or national concerns in this changing international system. For the longest time, now, Russia has sort of maintained, a lot of analysts, that, you know what, they don't want to be so much part of the international liberal order, that they don't want to just be rule takers in terms of what the US decides. They want to be at the table, making rules, making norms, making principles, and that this is actually the true way of sort of multipolar politics. So bearing in mind sort of Matt's observation that the US is in relative decline, it's not something we like to talk about, it's not something we ever debated on a presidential level, where to you is that line between acknowledging that other countries have interests, might want to change and transform some of the parts of the international world order that we're a part of, versus maintaining a consistent and steady policy, especially towards Russian interference or Russian aggression? How do we sort that out? And then maybe we'll change the order here in response. So maybe start with you, Peter, and then let's go backwards on this one.
Wow. To me, this is probably the core issue in the relationship between the U.S. and the Russians. I see the U.S. as definitely the defender of the old liberal international order. Putin wishes to change that, and he's got a whole new model that he's offering other countries in the world that plays on great fear of change, fear of demographics. Europe is the perfect example here, that I think he sees things going on in the world that allow him to sell his model of what we need is more strong central leadership, an authoritarian grip in our governing systems. We need to preserve our cultures and our values the way we see good values. If you've ever heard some of our Russian speakers come and they talk about this values issue, their values are not the same as ours in the sense of diversity, inclusion. Their sense is more of we have pure values, we know what good values are, and you people are tainting those values with your excessive liberalism. The other argument I've heard in this regard is your obsession with rule of law. It's your rule of law that allows this kind of weirdness and bad behavior and homophobia, if you will. Your systems perpetuate what we call bad values. So I don't know that we can have a dialogue about that, but I do think it's important to have a dialogue about areas where perhaps we might agree in countering terrorism, finding ways to deal with societal unrest in ways where both sides can make their points, because stability, in Putin's view, is important to preventing terrorism. In our view, stability is not necessarily a bad thing either in terms of reducing the prospects of wars like we have in Syria.
Yep. Celeste?
I think it is the case that this Russian leadership's values are not consistent with American values and those of many countries in the international system, and that is one of the reasons for the clashes, and that leads to many of the disconnections in interests. So where I would start is I would say, let's start with the basics, which is the rules of the game, which in fact Russia did sign on to. So you start with an expectation that, okay, we can disagree about, whether Russia violated the INF Treaty. It did. We can disagree about a whole host of issues and maybe negotiate about them, but let's at least start by living up to the commitments that we've made, which include respecting the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Russia's neighbors. Russia benefits from those rules too. You know, the Russian Federation is a different looking entity than the Russian Empire was over history. But in the 20th century, we came to understand in the international system that constantly having conventional wars over borders in Europe and Eurasia was destructive, counterproductive, in the loss of life, countered the ability to be prosperous and secure. And so there was a benchmark set of rules accepted by many countries, including Russia and China. So you start there. So I think that if you could at least sit down with the Russian leadership and the Chinese leadership and agree on those rules that they've already signed up to and implementing those, you could talk about, you know, differing interests and agree to disagree on values. But what we shouldn't do, and I'm not going to say that you were arguing this, Alex, but I want to be clear, is just because the Russian leadership articulates different values, which include some that Peter referred to, does not mean the United States should have to apologize for our values and seeking to make sure that our foreign policy protects our values and our interests at home. The President of the United States has a duty to the American people, which includes listening to adversaries in the international system and not seeking conflict. But no American president should somehow throw American values and interests away because others in the international system might disagree.
Sure, thanks. Carmel?
Yeah, I agree with Celeste, everything Celeste just said. I mean, I guess I reject the notion that Putin is motivated by fundamental values or beliefs. I think he's much more self-interested. I think he's exploiting the openness of democratic societies, not just the United States, but all around the world, to distract from what he's not delivering for his own people. He's creating this sense of Russians need to rally behind him to promote Russian values and interests. But I don't think it's philosophical. I think it's tactical on his part. And I think what we need to do is the exact opposite of what the current president is doing, unfortunately, which is to renew our friendships and alliances with those with whom we share values, other democracies, others that have other shared values, to push back on the actions of not just Russia, but other authoritarian governments that are trying to, again, exploit the openness of democracies. And I think we need to get our own house in order. So we need to make it harder for them to exploit our openness by passing campaign finance reform, by demanding that our public servants live by high ethics and their private interests are not mixed with public interest, which includes the President of the United States. So our campaign proposed reforms to the president's pardon power, so he couldn't feel free to put his personal interests above public interests, because there would be accountability, impeachment, yes, but even beyond impeachment, by tolling the statute of limitations on when a president violates criminal law, and limiting his ability to pardon those involved in investigations against his or her actions. I think it means strengthening our election security, but also tackling the interference that Russia is engaged in isn't just in terms of breaching the DNC's databases, it's also misinformation through social media. So I think we need to be much more aggressive about demanding that social media platforms also protect the integrity of our democracy. So I think there's lots of action that needs to be taken. Again, that's not just in terms of our foreign policy posture with respect to Russia and others, but also in terms of what we need to do in terms of domestic policy to strengthen our ability to not be exploited.
Thanks, Rocha. Matt, same to you.
So first, I just want to recognize what you said about not personalizing it in Putin too much. I mean, I think certainly Putin sits atop this system. Putin does sit atop this system. Thank you. To a great extent, but he does have to manage politics a bit. But I still think there are things that Putin has made clear very much are his personal preferences and sort of, I guess we can call them obsessions, for lack of a better word. So I think there's 2 points I want to make here. First, with regard to kind of the relative share of American power and this kind of new global order that's arising. You know, I remember being at an event probably about 6-7 years ago where there was a panel of what was called, I don't hear this much anymore, but the BRICS, you know, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and the question was asked, what does your country, what do you want from the global order? And the Indian, there was the editor of India's largest paper, I forget his name, but he said, we want to get away from this idea that we just want to be at the table. We want to be in the kitchen. We want to be cooking the food. We don't want to just have to sit at the table and eat the food, although we appreciate it. We would like to come and cook the food with you. We would like to be really invested and part of the process of how global order is arranged. And actually, I think that's manageable. I mean, I think Russia and China and Iran and other adversaries have very ably exploited resentments that exist at what is perceived, in some cases quite rightly, as American heavy-handedness in its dominance of the global order. So we're never going to totally solve the problem, but I think there is a way we can ameliorate it by being more engaged in, more genuinely, and I think we have to do that. The second part, I think, is more difficult, and that has to do with the values question. Now, I think one thing we've seen from Putin, and we see it in our own society, is the kind of elevation of this idea of sovereignty. The nation is sovereign. Who is the nation? When you try to export your multiculturalism to Russia or wherever, you are violating our sovereignty. This idea that all people, that Christians and Muslims should be equal, you're violating our sovereignty. When you say that gays should live as equals with straight people and be treated just as any other citizens are treated, you are violating our sovereignty. And I think it's as someone who grew up during the Cold War, to see, the way that opinions, especially among Republicans, have shifted with regard to Russia, is fascinating and a little bit disturbing to me. But I think part of it is that Putin has reinvented himself as an avatar of white Christian nationalism. And this is part of what he is selling to Europe, and he is selling it to the United States. So, when we talk about American values, I know what we mean in general. I would like to think we all know what we mean, but I think there are some Americans who are not quite clear on that, because they are very attracted to the set of values and this concept of sovereignty that Putin is talking about, because they are talking about it themselves. And this is something Senator Sanders has spoken and written about, that Putin is creating relationships with other right-leaning, authoritarian-leaning, illiberal governments who are in a lot of cases democratic, but are also developing this very majoritarian, illiberal, nationalist approach. We're talking about Brazil, we're talking about Hungary, we're talking about Israel under Netanyahu, even the right-leaning parties in UK and Germany and France. They find this idea very attractive. They have a very exclusive definition of what it means to be the nation. And I think this is part of the challenge we face in this country as well.
Thanks so much. This has been fascinating so far. I'd love to ask 7 more questions about U.S.-Russian relations, but I'm going to take my opportunity to ask a question just to bring this in a slightly different direction, given that we have people on here who are working or have been very recently working in campaigns. And so the question I wanted to ask is, how does the impeachment proceedings, being so centrally located around Ukraine, change how the campaigns have to engage with talking about Russia? And I'd be interested in this both in terms of the primaries, but also in terms of the general election. And if you think about it, right, it is a very bizarre moment for thinking about Russia in the context of the campaign. Not a really radically parallel universe, but just like a slightly parallel universe, Fiona Hill could be on this panel, right? And instead she's testifying before Congress right now. And so, is it the case that we look at this and we say, all right, look, this is about Ukraine, it's not about Russia, it doesn't make any difference for how the campaigns think about Russia? Or is it about that what's going on at the heart of the impeachment thing, it's Ukraine, but really it's about the president once again reaching out and asking for foreign interference in an electoral campaign, and so does that raise the salience of the Mueller report, something maybe campaigns would have wanted to put on the back burner? Is there suddenly now pressure to talk about foreign electoral interference again in the course of the campaign? Or is it something that just by dint of being Ukraine back in the news, right, that we're discussing Ukraine, we're constantly having explainers about what's going on with Ukraine, that somehow highlights the importance of the post-Soviet world generally in the political mindset of the American people, but also raises this question again of, as we said, this sort of as Peter, you put it, this long-standing, the longest-standing thought. Before we had electoral interference in 2016, we had the annexation of Crimea and all of the aftermaths of what happened in the U.S. relations with the West. So I'm really curious about how this sort of rapid-fire events of the last month or two, right, when all these campaigns were in full swing, long before we heard about the whistleblower complaint, how does that change how campaigns think about Russia?
Got to direct you something.
We can go from the middle out this time if we want. Celeste, you were leaning in?
So I used to, as Josh and Alex know, I used to be a professor, and professors love long, complicated questions. And people in the policy world run away from long, complicated questions because you can get entrapped. So let me reframe what I think Josh wanted us to answer. From my point of view, what is happening with how Ukraine has now become, the issue of Ukraine has become embroiled in American domestic politics is heartbreaking. Ukraine is a country that deserves a better political leadership over the last 30 years than it often has had. It's a country where the citizens have voted multiple times in free and fair elections, and a couple of times in elections that were almost stolen, and yet they kept coming back and trying and believing in their own future and in their right to choose. And now there's a different frame in the United States, and I won't get deeply into it. So I am heartbroken for Ukraine, but I still believe that the United States has a role to play in supporting Ukraine, not just because Ukraine is a worthy partner, but again, for the reasons I suggested earlier, that supporting Ukraine is about protecting an international order that protects Americans. And that still is the stake. And pushing against a narrative of Ukrainian, all the elements, I don't want to get into all the elements of what we're now seeing claimed about Ukraine, reflects a lot about what Americans are concerned about at home. And you referred to that. So for the most part, I would say obviously the Ukraine issue has affected the need to keep the briefings flowing up the chain of command and let people know what's going on. But in terms of our major, sort of the Mayor Pete's commitment to supporting a global liberal order that is consistent with and important for American interests, the people he talks about at home, is exactly the same as it was before this erupted. So I don't really think, fundamentally, to come back to your question, I don't think it's changed our responsibilities and what we need to do to make that case to the American people.
Carmel?
Yeah, I guess from our campaign's perspective, from Beto's perspective, it was a welcome thing, not an unwelcome thing, that this was just yet another piece of evidence that the president was using his position in a corrupt way to advance his own political interests and remind people that the Mueller report really laid out that he, even before taking office, had broken campaign finance and many laws in the pursuit of promoting his own candidacy. So the connection there was seen as a positive thing because I think from our perspective, we thought that the Mueller report shouldn't be put on the shelf, that it is laid out very clearly that President Trump had engaged in illegal activity and should be accountable for that. And then what transpired with respect to Ukraine, which what I point out, we really had the fact pattern of that in May, but having the president essentially say out loud on national television that he did it, and I think became the straw that broke the camel's back, that we no longer could we needed to demand accountability because he was admitting to using his office to advance his own political interest and to the detriment of Ukraine and the international order. So I think it was, from our perspective, was seen as a positive.
Matt?
Sure. Well, just in terms of the way the campaign is thinking about it, I mean, I think from the perspective of a foreign policy advisor, it does keep a specific foreign policy issue in the news in an interesting way. For the senator himself, he's quite aware that as a member of the Senate, he will, at some point, likely be called upon to decide on the impeachment. But I would just say, I think what it has done, I think, yes, it's quite right. It's yet another piece of evidence of the way this president operates. It is a disturbing sign day after day of how far the Republican Party is willing to go to countenance and defend and apologize for what a president of their party does. But I also think it's an important piece of evidence also of how all of this, going back to Manafort and a lot of these other issues, they're basically white-collar crimes. This is about how money impacts our system, and this is part of what the Russians were doing in 2016 and beyond. You've got these two characters, Parnas and Fruman, who are these cronies of Giuliani's. We now have our Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who are characters in this little story. Spending money on giving money here, giving money there. This has to be how we ultimately deal with this problem. And it is bigger than Russia, but Russia's a particular problem here because where do Russian oligarchs and other oligarchs park their money? It's here in this city. It's in other major cities in the United States. So I think it is helpful, and I know I'm getting away from the kind of basis of the question, but just returning to, as we look at the kind of menu of items we need to address if we're talking about Russia, financial openness and financial reform is definitely one of them.
Okay, so let's hear from you. So if you have a question, do we have roving mics? Yes, so let's go over here to, and just again, for the record, just state your name and your affiliation. Let's go to Kim first. Over here.
Hi, thank you for this discussion. My name's Kimberly Martin. I'm a professor of political science at Barnard College. My question concerns an issue that I don't think any of you raised directly, which is that it seems over the last couple of years, Russia has taken advantage of a power vacuum in the Middle East to move in and make itself an absolutely crucial player. And I'm wondering if your president were to be elected, what would your president do to try to answer that Russian move into the Middle East in places like Syria and Libya, and what should the U.S. be doing on that vital area, at least in the past, of what the U.S. considered to be its national interests?
Great. And is that for anyone who wants to take it, or? All of them. Okay. All right.
I went first last time.
Yep, let's go, Matt. Matt, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would do was, and Senator Sanders and I think all of the candidates have said that they would rejoin the JCPOA. And this is important not just because the JCPOA is an important and very good nuclear agreement, but it's also a basis for a set of other talks that we must have. And Senator Sanders has said he would rejoin the JCPOA very quickly after becoming president, but then seek negotiations with Iran on a whole range of other issues. But the important thing here is to be moving with our allies in the P5+1. We have very, very serious issues with some of Iran's policies and behavior, both with regard to its own population, with regard to its support for Hezbollah, for Hamas. You can run down the list. We need to address those. But I think, when I was talking about earlier in my opening remarks, the way that Russia has exploited, has kind of exploited Trump's zero-sum approach, withdrawing from the JCPOA, Putin loves that. When we reimpose sanctions on our most important allies in Europe, essentially declaring economic war on these allies because they continue to honor an agreement we negotiated alongside them, that really works out in Russia's favor. So I think ending that tension, getting back into that agreement, and so we can move together with our allies to some of these other issues. One quick last point is, Trump has aligned himself very, very closely with the Saudis and the Emiratis. That he sees, the Saudis and the Emiratis have sold him on this idea of a regional conflict. They treat it as a Sunni-Shia conflict. I think that is inaccurate. It is a Saudi-Iran geopolitical conflict in which these religious identities are deployed. In my view, it's incorrect to see it as a religious conflict. I think the United States has no interest in aligning with one side over the other. Our interest is in working to kind of bring these two sides to some workable modus vivendi. I think there are echoes of what Obama wanted to do. He wanted to move from the JCPOA ultimately towards some future, not quickly, but at some point finding small areas of at least negotiation and possible cooperation so that there was less conflict and more, more regional security in which all of the regional states were investing in that.
The first point to make is that we need to understand that you can't remake what's been broken. And so the Russian now success in occupying northern Syria is done, and the next president's going to have to deal with a Russia that has influence and presence in northern Syria and is consolidating the ability of the Assad regime to control all of Syrian territory, which also advances Iranian interests because of the Iranian relationship with the Syrian regime. And so the United States is going to need partners and allies who are concerned about the potential rise again of Islamic State in that region. The United States, first and foremost, to cope with Russian enhanced position in the Middle East, needs to reinvest in the transatlantic relationship, because we need Europe. We need to not be sanctioning Europe. We need to be working with Europe in our common interests to help to prevent the rise of extremism or the ability of violent extremist groups to use territory in that region to strike at our societies and our citizens. So there isn't a direct answer on how to push Russia out of Syria or necessarily outcompete Russia in running after authoritarian regimes or offering them very lucrative arms deals. We have to go back to our strengths, which are about long-term, strong relationships. The credibility of when the American president says that U.S. troops are going to be there and have a partner's back, like the United States told the Kurdish fighters in northern Syria, and they were doing the work for us. We told them we were going to be there. We told them our presence there was going to, allow them to pull back from that border. And then this president just completely undermined that. We're going to have to rebuild that credibility because partners in the region are going to have to want to be associated with American commitment, American strengths, and American long-term partnership and what we can bring to the table rather than ephemeral of-the-moment deals with a Russia that is very good at exploiting our failure to be there.
If I could just add a couple of points. One, I very much agree with Matt. I think this is less a conflict about the Sunni-Shia divide and much more a battle, and I would add several players to this battle, to be the regional hegemon, to be the key actor. So you've got Saudi Arabia, you've got Iran. I would add Turkey to that. Erdogan definitely has ambitions. It's not the neo-Ottoman guy, but clearly I think what's happened in North Syria reveals a little bit more about how he thinks about things. Egypt, not so much, but if you ask the Egyptians, they still think they're a very important player. So there's a lot of players involved in here. Second point, in my view, we need to stay engaged with the Russians on the ground in Syria. We're still there, despite the initial report that we were all leaving, we're still there. There are areas where we still need to deconflict. We need to have a conversation. But beyond that, I would argue down the road, if and when there's ever an endgame in Syria, and I have questions in my own mind whether that's going to happen, but if we get to one, I firmly believe the Russians and Iranians are not going to be on the same page because their fundamental interests are different. And to the extent we're still engaged with the Russians on this, this is an area that we can work, fertile ground to maybe exploit these inevitable fissures because their goals are so different. And Israel is a big piece of this, by the way. So we need to stay engaged with all these actors, try to re-insinuate ourselves, as it were, into some of these key roles that we previously had, which the Russians seem to enjoy right now. But I don't think the Russians are entirely in the catbird seat. They're going to have to sit on this problem in North Syria for a while. We'll see how that plays out.
Okay.
Just briefly, I agree with what everyone has said, and I think the most important thing we can do is to reject this go-it-alone strategy that we've been engaged in under the current administration and rebuild those relationships with our allies, re-examine our treaty obligations and make good on them and build on them. And I'd also just note that it's not just in terms of Russia insinuating itself in the heart of the situation in Syria, but they're also doing it in Latin America. So it's something we just have to become much more globally engaged, but do it through a position of strength, which means to go into these situations with our people who we share our values and our partners and allies.
Great. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is maybe take a cluster of questions and then ask the panel to address the ones that they feel most inclined to take. So let's start over here.
My name's Michael Schwartz. I'm a reporter with the New York Times. Two quick questions. Ms. Wallander, you mentioned curtailing Russia's behavior with deterrence framework. I'm wondering if you could all expand on what you mean by that and what tools you think you have to actually have some kind of an impact on Russia's behavior abroad. Sanctions don't seem to be working. There's been some effort to use the American cyber capabilities to deter some behavior, but we've yet to see a lot of that. So if you could speak to that. And then I'm wondering just if you could, if any of you have pondered what Russia might look like in a post-Putin era. And I know that's still an open question about when he will depart, but with each passing day we get closer and closer to that moment, and as we know, transitions of power in Russia can tend to be rocky affairs. So I'm curious to know if you put any thought into that and what you think a U.S. response to a transition of power in Russia might look like.
That's great. Let's also bundle a couple more, and then we'll come back. One over there.
Hello, Olga Kostunova, Institute of Modern Russia. My question is pretty short. So in 2012, Mitt Romney called Russia America's number one geopolitical foe. So do you agree with that? And a short one to that. If your respective candidate would to become American president, where would you list Russia in the list of your priorities in foreign policy?
Great question. And let's do one more over here. You've been very patient.
Hi, how you doing? Justin Anderson with Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. I hope in my post-2020 dream world that whoever's president is going to actively combat or try to mitigate climate change. So I don't really think that we can talk about mitigating climate change without talking about the role that oil plays in Russia. I mean, they have 50% of their budget pretty much comes from fossil fuel receipts. They stand to benefit from, the Arctic opening up and whatnot. So I'm curious as to potential strategies for presidential candidates to take in negotiating with Russia on climate change matters, on reduction of fossil fuels. Are there carrots, sticks that we can use? Do we continue multilateral, bilateral agreements, stuff like that? So I just wanted to get your take on that.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So a lot on the table there. Instruments for deterrence, Russia in a post-Putin era, the Romney quote in retrospect, Russia in a list of priorities, and energy and climate change. So Matt, let's kick off with you.
Sure. Thank you. No, I'll go to that last question first. Obviously, the senator has said for a long time he sees climate change as the #1 national security issue. People kind of laughed when he said that in 2016. I don't think anyone's laughing now. I think there's a much broader understanding, having seen some of the consequences, that it very much is. I think we need to be realistic about what we can actually achieve with Russia, given Russia's interest, as you said, in the energy market, particularly with regard to Europe. They see, in addition as a source of revenue, it's also a very important foreign policy tool in Russia's toolkit. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. We most certainly should, rejoining Paris and then beyond. And we'll see, just trying to sit with the Russians to see what can be achieved. I remember talking to former Ambassador Wendy Sherman when she talked about the engagement that she led with the Iranians. Just the practice of sitting down at the table with the Iranians was an enormous education, and how the Iranians perceive their own interests and what possibilities might exist for some agreement that Americans hadn't even considered before because they hadn't gotten this far in a negotiation. So I would say that piece of wisdom argues just for continuing to try to talk about these issues. You know, the cliche is that politics is the slow boring of hard boards. Sometimes you get a big dent in that board, and it's worth continuing to bore it. And the other piece is obviously arms control. Other people have talked about it up here. I agree we need to start thinking about that in a different way. But I would say, first of all, because the Russian nuclear arsenal is an existential threat to the United States, but I think there are actually more areas in which an agreement or smaller agreements could be struck on those issues as opposed to climate change. But we should continue to try on both. Let me get to one of these others. I mean, the question of what Russia looks like after Putin, I mean, it's hard to say. I think Susan Glasser wrote a really interesting piece about this in Foreign Affairs pretty recently, where she actually compared Putin to Brezhnev, given the way that the system looks right now and how Putin is trying to manage it. But you know, I think the best we can say is that whoever the president is just needs to make clear to that successor how he or she views America's actual interest, and not to say this alone, but again, to return to this theme of alliances, to say this in chorus with a number of very strong allies, to say, listen, we're not interested in a conflict, we want to be clear about where our interests diverge, but we are open to sitting and talking about finding some area of cooperation.
Carmel?
Yeah, I mean, I think Russia needs to be on the top of the list of priorities for the next president, as I said in the beginning, not just because our democracy is at risk, in part due to Russia's actions, so that's something we have to hold them accountable for and fight back and prevent them from interfering in our democracy. But the threat that stems from the nuclear arsenal is obviously something that we have to tackle proactively. And then as the question asked just a moment ago demonstrates, there's so many areas of the world where there's instability that Russia is at the heart of, whether that's Venezuela or Syria. So we need to contend with Russia as we stand up to them, but also in collaboration with allies, work towards creating progress on these critical issues, and hopefully in a post-Putin world that will be easier to do, but I don't think we can wait for that. I think we're going to have to contend with them in the short term. I do think when you think about a post-Putin world, it is important, and think more broadly about the need to engage with Russia on so many critical issues, the Arctic space, that we need to be careful about as we're defending ourselves in terms of their violations against us, in terms of our elections and our democracy, that we're not condemning the Russian people, that hold their government accountable, hold actors accountable for what they're doing in violation of international law, but be laying a groundwork for a longer term, more positive relationship.
So on energy and climate change, the challenge is that it is the production and sale of energy that actually fuels the form of political power at home. And so it is unlikely, I think, that you can negotiate with this Russian leadership to make oil and natural gas less important to their economy. What you can do, though, and we've seen this, is when international energy prices fall, it really complicates sort of internal calculations about budgets, politics, relationships in the business sector. And so what the United States really can do to kind of help Russia get past its, kind of an element of its crony capitalism, which is those energy resources, is to invest in renewables, into diversifying energy sources, is to increase energy efficiency. All the things we should be doing anyway are things that actually lower the value of those resources internally and hopefully begin to erode some of the negative effects that you've referred to. On climate change, actually, I would agree. The Arctic Council is actually one of the few fora that still work in U.S., Russia, and even better, it's a multilateral format, right? It's not just the U.S. and Russia talking, it is the Arctic countries, and then with other countries that are observers, talking about issues of safe sea lane management, climate change. And while early on, a lot of Russian commentators and officials were of the view that our climate change is going to be great for Russia, right? Because you're going to suddenly have warmer temperatures in the Russian far north and the sea lanes opening up, they're beginning to see that actually climate change is hurting Russian interests. The permafrost is thawing. Cities and towns and industry and infrastructure and roads are sinking or are breaking in the Russian far north. And so there may be an opportunity to find a common discussion about the urgency of addressing some of these issues in a forum that actually has retained its value and remains a multilateral area for talking to Russia. On deterrence, deterrence has to be specific to a particular behavior. So you can't deter, and if I said it wrong, I apologize. You can't just deter a country from doing all kinds of amorphous things. Deterrence needs to be, appropriate to the behavior in question, and you have to bring the right instruments to bear. So I would distinguish between deterring and preventing Russian intervention in our elections and interference in our elections, which is the context in which I brought up deterrence as an important element of U.S. strategy, as opposed to classic deterrence in a military sense. In the election context, the most important thing to do when you're trying to credibly deter a potential adversary or an actual adversary is to make clear that it's not going to work. So you invest in the capabilities that defend yourself and reduce your own vulnerabilities. So deterrence is not just about imposing costs. It's about making clear that it's not going to work. So by healing our own internal politics, by fixing our own electoral systems, by getting federal funding to improve electoral systems across America, by getting some kind of public-private discussion about the role of Russian interference in social media. Those are the things you can do which aren't about imposing costs on the Kremlin, but are reducing Russia's ability. And it's better always to choose policies over which you have control, right? So prioritize the things that you can do on your own to protect and defend yourself and prevent a potential adversary from exploiting your weaknesses and thinking that it will succeed. And in the area of conventional deterrence, I think the United States has already done quite a bit. Although it depends on the coherence and the strength of the NATO alliance to make sure that the credibility of deterring Russian conventional military operations in American treaty allied countries is clear and the capabilities are quite apparent. And that has been done over the last 5 years. It's actually been sustained even in the Trump administration. What's in question more is the political coherence of NATO, and that's something that the next president is going to have to get to work on. On one of the other questions is where would you put Russia, where should Russia be as a priority to the next president? The next president doesn't have the luxury of having a simple priority list. And I would agree that, Mayor Pete has said that climate is a national security priority. So the priorities of the next president are going to be substantive issues or issues that are country-specific, like climate change, where you can't achieve them alone as the United States. You need to work in partnership with other countries in the international system. It's going to be issues like countering violent extremism, supporting the development of economic models that are equitable and sustainable in countries like those of Africa, where you see rising youth populations. Those are all going to be really important priorities. So you can't define the priorities of the next president only in terms of what countries will be important. Though what's going to be important are the issues that affect American interests and values, and then how other countries affect our ability or our inability to address those priority interests globally.
If I could tack on to that to get to your question, Michael. Money. One of the things that strikes me about Russian foreign policy in the recent past is it's a much smarter foreign policy than when I was a young analyst in the 80s. Military force, the use of Cuban surrogates, huge defense spending. If you look around at where the Russians are actively involved now, obviously Ukraine, Syria, but I'm struck at all the other places. Take your pick. Kim, you've done work on Central African Republic. There's this fascinating article about Madagascar recently. Venezuela. I could go on and on and on. And the thing that strikes me in all of them is it's relatively inexpensive, relatively low risk, and yet the Russians are trying to get money. It's always about money. They use surrogates in terms of the Wagner Group. They try to get money, and then my question is, where does all that money go? And Matt, you talked about needing to deal with illicit finance. Well, where's all that money going? It's in London, it's in many cities in the US, and it gets to the heal yourself issue about the United States. Until we come to grips with the fact that we're a big part of this problem, we allow these people to park money and jack up all the real estate prices around here, so it's hard to buy an apartment in New York. Take your pick. But until we have to deal with that issue, because that's a huge enabler for the Russians' ability to take all this money. Again, just on the Syria piece, I'm struck that we're watching the Russians now and the Iranians both talk about, well, who's going to get access to what oil and gas reserves, because we need to get paid. We just made a big investment in your survival, Mr. Assad. So again, I'm just struck. It's a very pragmatic approach. The Russians have used Syria as this great test beds for new weapons. They've gotten a lot of combat experience for their guys, although they're not in the front trenches. They're not like the Shia militia from Iraq, and they're not Hezbollah. They're in comfortable little bases, generally out of the firefight. So I'm just struck at the pragmatism and the cost-benefit analysis that goes on, and it's something that hopefully we can try to attack through dealing with reforms about illicit finance, investment, and transparency.
It's a really fascinating point, Peter. Thank you. So we are almost out of time, so I want to hand it over to Josh for some closing remarks and also let us know about our next event, which is not unrelated to this event.
Right. So, yes. Well, I want to thank once again, on behalf of the Jordan Center and the Harriman Institute, our panelists for joining us today. It's been a fascinating discussion. It's been great to hear all of these things aired. I'm sure this is going to be continuing on and on going forward. I think a lot of the questions that were raised at the end are things we could have spent a lot longer discussing going forward now, and it is, I would reiterate, again, a sort of fascinating moment for thinking about the role of Russia in the campaign, and so we really do appreciate you taking the time and coming to talk to us tonight. I do want to tease the next element in our New York City Russia Public Policy series, which will be taking place on January 23rd, and we're going to be discussing, this will be down at NYU at the Jordan Center, but we're going to be discussing the role of Ukraine in the Ukraine scandal, but from the Ukrainian perspective. So we've gathered together a collection of Ukrainian experts. We're going to have Keith Darden, Oksana Shevel, Olga Onek, and Jordan Gans-Moors, who are going to join us on January 23rd. So if you want to mark calendars now, I imagine there may be things going on around January 23rd related to what's going on in Ukraine, but you'll get a lot from many of the people in the room here from the U.S. Politics perspective of it, but we want to take that opportunity to talk about the Ukraine perspective on it and what was hinted at in some of the answers, and Celeste in particular, in your answer about like what this has meant for Ukraine, but the Ukraine perspective on it. So we hope to see many of you there, and we'll have more events coming in the spring. And on behalf of Alex and myself, I really want to thank all of you for venturing out in the cold tonight. Actually, on my way over here, I was told that it's actually colder in New York than it is in Moscow or St. Petersburg today. So with that note, we'll send you back out into New York City, and please join me in thanking our panelists for their time today.